It's wonderful to be here. I want to thank everybody at FIMS for being such amazing hosts and the other speakers for their wonderful talks, and all of you for being here. I love the framing for this conference. In fact, I considered stealing it for the title of my book, briefly. The book, there's some debate about the title at the moment. But I really feel like this is where so many of our important political discussions need to begin, as opposed to sort of meander their way to eventually. And I want to start by telling you how I interpret this phrase, system error, as it applies to the work that I've been doing. At the simplest level, the error, in my view, is that what our economic system defines as success, unfettered economic growth, endless accumulation on the he who dies with the most toys wins credo, is, from an ecological perspective, a recipe not just for failure, but for collapse. Now, climate change is the most obvious and pressing manifestation of that collapse, in that we are headed right now, if we simply continue on our current economic trajectory, for warming of between 4 and 6 degrees above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century or sooner. Now that projection, which is a pretty alarming projection, comes from very conservative sources, and this has started to happen just in the past couple of years, where the World Bank issued a report saying that we are on a trajectory for a 4-degree world. The International Energy Agency, once again, a very sort of staid, conservative institution, says that we're actually on a path to 6 degrees of warming. PricewaterhouseCoopers, once again, not 350, not a radical climate organization, says that we're headed towards a 6-degree world if we continue with business as usual. That's the description. So to put those numbers in perspective, where we're at now is we have already warmed the planet by 0.8 degrees Celsius over industrial levels. And look at what we're already seeing. Look at what 0.8 looks like. It looks like superstorms, having to invent new words to describe storms because they're getting so weird. Australia had to add a new color to their climate maps because things were getting so hot. A few months ago, there was a story about bats dropping from the skies in Australia because it had just gotten too hot. Simple as that. But we're also looking at these really scary kind of tipping point moments, like the 97% of Greenland's ice sheet surface melting last summer. Last week, I don't know if some of you saw this story. I'm sorry about this sort of scary stuff, but my family lives in BC. I'm very attached to the BC coast, especially as a new mom, I feel it so intensely that I want this beautiful world to survive for long enough for my son to be able to enjoy it. I find myself bargaining with starfish, just hang in there. Because there's been this wasting disease of the Pacific starfish just this year. But just last week, we heard news that the scallop fishery in British Columbia, off of Vancouver, is collapsing. 10 million scallops dead because the larva, the scallop larva, when they are just a couple of days old, can't form shells. Now, we knew that this was one of the effects of climate change. Scientists have been telling us for a long time that as the oceans acidify, all of the hard-shelled creatures, the oysters, the coral, the scallops, will not be able to form their shells. But they made this little mistake, which male scientists often make. They forgot about babies. So they were only looking at the impact on adult creatures. And they didn't realize that the larva would be so much more vulnerable. And they also didn't realize that our oceans would acidify this quickly. So they're acidifying faster along the coasts. And it's a combination of the impact of climate change, the fact that our oceans are our largest carbon sink. They're absorbing the atmospheric carbon, but also just that intersecting with natural processes that weren't necessarily understood or projected, that there's more corrosive water coming from the depths than was projected. And lo and behold, you have these die-offs. Oysters, same thing happening in Washington State, in Oregon. There's actually a hatchery, an oyster hatchery in Washington State that has now started, it has opened a satellite hatchery in Hawaii, and it brings the oysters, this has just started, I think, last year, in their infancy, in their larval state. They stay in Hawaii, and then he mails them back once they've formed their shells to Washington State. This is not a sustainable climate solution, to be mailing oysters back and forth. That's what 0.8 degrees looks like. We have, frankly, no idea what 4 degrees, 6 degrees looks like. We are not in control. And this is what the climate scientists are telling us when they say, that they can imagine a 2-degree world, but not necessarily a 4 or a 6-degree world, because this is when you start triggering all of these tipping points. I think one of the things that's different about the nature of this crisis than what Warren Steele was talking about, because nuclear weapons are another existential crisis. We have, as a species, looked at our own annihilation before. We've been actually looking at it for a long time now. And I don't think this is about competing, what's worse, nuclear war or climate change, right? But I do think that there is something particular about what I'm describing, in that we don't have to do anything in order to bring about this future, right? Whereas the discourse around nuclear weapons is always, what if? What if disaster strikes? What if a crazy person has their hand on the button? There are always scenarios in which that doesn't happen, right? That's not the world we're talking about when we talk about climate change. The projections we're being told is if we do what we're doing and into the future, then there's a high degree of likelihood that we will bring about these outcomes. So that's one way in which we're seeing a system error, this tension between the growth imperative and the planetary imperative, between the rules of economics and the rules of nature. But we have these other signs of ecological collapse, most of which are linked to climate change, but in many cases, climate change isn't the major determining factor. In some cases, it's just straight up resource depletion, like overfishing or pollution, and how that's affecting fresh water sources. But that's an example where you have a layering of crisis. Climate affects it, pollution affects it, overuse affects it. These aren't the only errors in our system. Those are a few of the ecological externalities, as the economists call them. But we also have these internal contradictions within the economic system itself, where we are pushing our human systems to the brink of collapse in many ways, which I would argue is stemming from a similar problem of taking and using up and not reinvesting, not taking care, not giving back, not replenishing. And I think we see this in the state of our crumbling infrastructure in Canada. This same kind of a crisis. I think we see it with the state of our healthcare system, with the state of our homeless shelters. I mean, we have allowed so much to deplete and collapse, not just in nature, in our constructed world. And then you also have contradictions like the fact that the quest for short-term profits, which is, of course, part of the growth imperative in the corporate world, contradicts with the need for a ever-growing consumer class able to buy the products being produced. And if people aren't making enough money, then they can't afford to keep growing the economy. So then you have debt crises, like the subprime mortgage crisis, where we're basically floating consumers to be able to keep buying. And that is also, as we recently saw, a recipe for collapse. And then we respond to those crises in ways that I describe in the Shock Doctrine. By putting our systems under even more stress, we respond with austerity. We can't invest. That's the way we are navigating our way out of that economic crisis around the world. Now, is this just capitalism, what I'm describing? Yes, but it's more than capitalism. I actually think that a lot of this is common to all of the dominant economic models of the 20th century. That really this is about something that Latin American scholars have taken to calling extractivism. And I think it's a useful word, and it explains why we're seeing similar patterns even in left-wing governments, not just of the past, but of the present in Latin America. You know, Latin America's left-wing governments are even more reliant on extractive policies than their predecessors, if we think about Bolivia, Venezuela, Ecuador. I'm not saying that those governments aren't doing some great things with the money that they are raising, but they are extractivist, fundamentally extractivist governments. They're still within this mindset of treating the planet as if it is limitless, although their rhetoric has shifted significantly. So what is extractivism? I don't think it's just about taking from the earth. You know, everybody has to take from the earth. All living creatures extract. I think extractivism is about a mentality that tells you that you can take without giving back. It is a non-reciprocal, often non-consensual relationship with extraction. And I think that applies as much to our relationship with the natural world, with the extracting of so-called natural resources, as it does to our system's relationship to labor. We extract labor from human beings out of relationship and push systems, human bodies, as well as the broader natural world, beyond their breaking points, often. We try to extract maximum value. So those are some of the system errors that I see. But I am going to be talking mostly about climate change, because I think it is helpful to see it as a kind of a meta-crisis in which all of these other crises fit within, which is not to say that it's more important. You know, everybody stop everything else that you're doing because climate change is the end of the world and everybody should focus on climate change. A lot of environmentalists talk that way, and it really tends to turn people off. But our house is on fire, not to be overly melodramatic. We should probably take a look at that. If we go to the heart of this crisis, I think if we diagnose it properly, if we come up with responses, I don't like the word solutions because I think it's bigger than solutions. If we come up with responses that are attempts to address the heart of the crisis, that mentality of extractivism, then I think we have a chance of addressing so many of those other problems, so many of those other crises of inequality, of deep injustices that are left to fester, so many other ways in which we are taking and not giving back. And I'll elaborate on that. But the problem, once again, in a nutshell, is that our economy needs growth, and our planet needs a radical contraction of carbon emissions starting this decade. You know, one of the mistakes I think that the environmental movement has done is make this a lot more complicated than it actually is. You know, you hear all of this talk of, 80% by 2050 and this by 2020, and sort of everybody's mind just gets overwhelmed by the numbers, and the general sense that people take away is not now, not right now. When if you go deeper into those numbers, everyone understands that we can't start at 2050. There's no way. It's like slamming on the brakes in a car right before you hit the wall, you're going to hit it. We have to taper off. And if we are to have any hope, we have to start now. This is decade zero of the climate crisis. We're halfway through it. So the contradiction between the fact that the planet needs a contraction in emissions and that we have an economic model that requires growth is that there is this very tight correlation between economic growth and carbon emissions in our current system. In my book, and if some of you read the New Statesman article that was mentioned, I rely really heavily on an amazing climate scientist, one of the leading climate scientists in the world named Kevin Anderson. He was director of the Tyndall Institute in the UK in Manchester, which is one of the leading research institutions focused on climate and climate change solutions. And his colleague Alice Bowes, they work closely together. And they have outlined very, very clearly, and I really urge you to look up Kevin Anderson and Alice Bowes' work. These are mainstream climate scientists. They advise the British government. They work with the UN. They are sort of establishment figures, but they are among a growing group of establishment climate scientists who have started saying some very, very radical things because their research is leading them to that place. And as Anderson points out, if it was 2 decades ago when we really started raising the alarm on climate change, there would have been ways of responding to this crisis that were not revolutionary, that were not that radical, because there was still time to have a much more radical response. But we've wasted 2.5 decades, right? The first Earth Summit in Rio was in 1992. And because of the nature of the science, which is that the carbon stays in the atmosphere, it's an accumulative problem, right? It's not about what was emitted last week. It's about all the carbon, really, that has been emitted since the Industrial Revolution, which sucks for you guys, because you're living with this Dickens's sins. But this is the nature of the system error. So what do they say? So they've been laying this out really, really clearly, which is what our governments have collectively agreed to when they get together and waste our time at climate summits is that they have agreed to keep temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius. Now, as I outlined before, that doesn't sound safe to me. If this is 0.8, 2 degrees doesn't sound safe to me. If you ask the residents of Tuvalu or the Maldives how 2 degrees sounds to them, it sounds like the end of their countries, okay? The end of their island states. But this is what the economists, for the most part, have said our global system can handle, 2 degrees of warming. So then there's all this complicated stuff around what are the percentages of reaching that. And so they have settled on giving us a 50-50 chance of staying below 2 degrees, right? Because this is not, we don't know exactly how much we can emit, so it's all averages. But they're saying if we take these governments at their word, at the agreements that they have made, including our government in Copenhagen in 2009, if we are to do what we say we are going to do, which is keep temperatures below 2 degrees, 50-50 chance, and also within the Copenhagen Agreement is that the emissions must be done on the basis of equity. And what that means is that it needs to recognize that because carbon is cumulative, and because countries like ours have been emitting carbon now for a very long time, since the Industrial Revolution, we bear more of the responsibility than the countries that have really just industrialized in the past couple of decades. And in fact, there is something called the right to development, that countries where you have hundreds of thousands of people without electricity, hundreds of millions of people without electricity, they have more of a right to carbon than people who want the carbon for an extra car. And so the basis of equity basically means that we who started it need to lead the solutions. It doesn't mean that China and India are off the hook. If China and India are off the hook, we're cooked. That's just the numbers, But so what they the other principle that they go with is that developing countries can peak their emissions in 2025, which is actually pretty soon. It's a decade from now. And then they need to start cutting emissions by 7% a year. So within this model, they're not off the hook, but they're given a kind of a boost to be able to develop in the next decade and pull people out of poverty, okay? So based on that, then we have a carbon budget. We know how much carbon we can emit and still have a 50-50 chance of staying below 2 degrees. And what that means is that we, in countries like Canada, the US, Australia, the EU countries, have to start cutting our emissions by between 8 and 10% a year now. Okay? Now, that's a lot. And this is where it becomes a problem of our economic system. Where it becomes a problem is that that's the only time that has ever happened in the history of capitalism was in the aftermath of the great market crash of 1929. That's the only time there have been sustained carbon reductions of in the neighborhood of 10%. It didn't happen when the Soviet Union collapsed. It didn't happen in 2008 when the market crashed. There was only a dip for 1 year, and then it recovered, made up for lost time, actually. So what our economic system, how our economic system would respond to what our climate system is telling us we need to do is with a massive economic crisis. Okay, we don't want that. So that means that we, it seems to me, need a different kind of economic system that can actually handle what Kevin Anderson and Alice Bose describe as managed degrowth, okay? Now that phrase, managed degrowth, is an interesting one. It would mean that collectively we would decide how we want to plan our economy, how we want to contract in these coming years to achieve those kind of emission cuts. So we would decide, presumably we would decide that those parts of our economy that are very emission intensive, which tend to be the ones that are more based on consumption, would contract. But that doesn't mean that every part of our economy needs to contract, because there are parts of our economy that are much less carbon intensive. And those tend to be the service professions, teaching, the arts, caregiving, and, you know, and so we would have to prioritize. Now that sounds kind of not that scary, to me anyway. But the problem is then, and this comes, you know, intersects with one of the questions that was asked in the last session, which is, you know, about the neoliberal moment in which we find ourselves in, where we've been told there is no economic alternative. You know, you grew up, and I grew up in an era when we were told that you know, to plan your economy is quasi-communist. We leave everything to the genius of the market. We don't plan anymore. We don't prioritize. We just pursue growth, and growth takes care of everything. So we would have to rethink that. We would have to have a managed transition, but it doesn't need to be the end of the world. Meanwhile, we would obviously have to shift as rapidly as possible to have an economy that was based on renewable energy. Now, the problem with that in terms of just doing it right away, the reason why we can't just snap our fingers and say, okay, no, well, we're just going to switch from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and then we can keep consuming as much as we want, it's no problem. The problem with that is that if we accept the carbon budget, building that new infrastructure burns carbon, a lot of carbon. You know, we're talking about reimagining our transit systems, we're talking about reimagining our entire energy system. That is the work of our time. We can't get away from it. We have to do it. It will create jobs. We can make sure they're good jobs. And this is how we address all of these multiple crises at the same time. But it will burn carbon. And it will burn carbon in this decade, that is decade zero, which is why we need to plan it. We need to have a graceful descent plan. And we need to have an equitable descent plan. Because if it isn't equitable, then people aren't going to sign on. And, you know, one of the things that anybody who, you know, doesn't have a living memory of World War II, you know, anybody in that category doesn't have a memory of collective sacrifice. We don't think we know how to do it. But the truth is, humans have done this before, you know, in the name of a larger good, in the name of a larger project. They planted victory gardens and rationed goods because they understood that there was a plan, there was a vision. I don't think it's a perfect analogy. I think we are in uncharted territories, but I do think it's important when you hear these arguments that, you know, humans are incapable of sacrifice. It's not true. We have created a culture in which we've convinced ourselves that we are only greedy, that we are only, you know, hyper-competitive, but we have acted collectively in the past. We have that in our history to draw on. it's also true, I mean, one of the things that always amazes me about this argument that, you know, humans, they just don't like sacrifice, that's why we're hurtling headlong into this climate catastrophe. I mean, it seems to me when I look at the responses to the economic crisis that began in 2008, that humans are being asked to sacrifice all the time. You know, for the bankers, they're being asked to sacrifice their healthcare programs, their pensions, they're being asked to, you know, raise money for their kids' after-school programs and fill in all of these holes in our social safety net. So the truth is we do pull together. We're pulling together for the wrong reasons, but I believe we can do this, and that we're being indoctrinated to be told that we can't, that we're incapable. So I think when you imagine how you would manage that kind of a descent, it actually can be a pretty exciting prospect for job creation, for relocalizing our economies, reinventing our communities, for having healthier lifestyles. And, you know, coming from me, this is deeply ironic because I wrote a book about how the right has systematically used crisis to advance their agenda. That's what the Shock Doctrine is about. But what I talk about in the Shock Doctrine is that this whole strategy that the right developed was a response to the New Deal. It was a response to the fact that after the market crashed in 1929, you had a collective uprising where people demanded that there be solutions that actually got at the cause of the crisis, stabilizing the markets, a huge re-regulation of the banking sector. Glass-Steagall was passed and so on in the States. Massive public works, higher taxes for the wealthy. And you know what? They're still pissed off about it. And the whole phase that we have been living in, you know, has been described many times as a counter-revolution by the elites to undo the gains of that period, which is simply to say there is a strong progressive history of responding to moments of crisis in ways that deepen democracy, in ways that create more just societies, which is the opposite of what I describe in the Shock Doctrine, which is using crisis, using catastrophe, not to solve the original problem, but just to exploit the fear, the disorientation, to basically grab land, grab resources, privatize the public sphere. And I end the Shock Doctrine with Hurricane Katrina. You know, that's the sort of vision of the future that I describe in the book as disaster apartheid, or climate apartheid. Because, of course, Katrina was the intersection of heavy weather and weak infrastructure, right? It was this weird superstorm hitting up against neglected public infrastructure. And then we saw the response of well, you know, in the book I quote this, the minutes from a meeting that took place at the Heritage Foundation, which is a right-wing think tank in Washington, where they came up with 32 free market solutions for Hurricane Katrina. And it was everything from privatizing the education system to drilling for more oil in ANWR, in the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve. So it was like, okay, you have a crisis that was created by a weak public infrastructure and by probably fossil fuels, and the answer is let's get more fossil fuels and let's just get rid of the public sphere altogether and just build sort of fortress privatized enclaves. I'm not talking about doing that. I'm talking about using crisis to actually get at the underlying reasons why the crisis is happening in the first place. But it's, I think, important to understand that this is also the road we're on, you know? It's not just that if we do nothing, the temperatures are going to rise. It's that if we do nothing, then the same values that currently govern our society, the same political and economic forces that currently govern our society are going to consolidate and are going to do what they do in the midst of crisis, which is consolidate their power. And we've imagined this future so many times. We've imagined it so many times that I think one of our biggest problems is we have trouble imagining another kind of an ending. You know, this is just the sci-fi cliche. It's the Hunger Games, you know? It's Elysium, it's Mad Max. You know, no, it's the flood, the year of the flood. It's this combination of this dystopic ecological future combined with corporate rule, right? And I think we need to understand how these fantasies, the fact that we've grown up with them, has affected our brains, and to take back some agency. These narratives of saving the chosen few, they are deep in our culture, way beyond Hollywood disaster flicks. This is the Bible. This is, hey, me and my friends are going to get on this boat and check you all later, right? Or me and my friends are going to get saved, get taken to that gated city in the sky. So it's really deep in the Judeo-Christian DNA to believe that we are going to respond to disaster in this kind of apartheid-esque way. So we need to push our own brains to imagine another kind of a future. A couple of years ago, I went to the Heartland Institute's annual climate change denier confab. This is where all the big climate deniers get together and sort of trade theories about sunspots and Al Gore and stuff like that. And what's interesting about hanging out with these guys is it's really clear that they're not driven by the science. The Heartland Institute, which hosts this thing, is a free market think tank. They only got interested in climate science a decade ago, or less than that, actually. What they're all about is the same thing, Heritage and the American Enterprise Institute, who are also sponsors of this event. There's the Ayn Rand Institute handing out their pamphlets, and it's just this octopus of all these so-called free market think tanks getting together to deny climate change. Why? I wonder why. Because their entire worldview crashes if this is true, right? If it's true that that capitalism is waging war on life on Earth, then they've got a problem, because deregulation really hasn't worked that well. But more than that, the responses to climate change are so obviously collective responses. They so obviously are about having a strong public sphere and acting collectively in all the things that they have said we shouldn't do while we just leave it in the hands of the market. So the evidence is such a threat to their worldview that they have decided that they will deny the science. And if you look at the polling in this country and in the United States and Australia and Britain, for some reason it's mostly English-speaking countries that have this problem. But it used to be, as recently as 2006, that people who believed in climate change and who didn't believe in anthropogenic climate change, it used to be mostly a measure of their education level, right? People who were more educated believed it was true. People who were less educated weren't so sure. But then there was this complete divide that broke post-2007, where it became a litmus test for your other political views. And Democrats and liberals and so on continued to believe in climate change, but the bottom fell out of conservative belief in climate change. Like literally went from like 70% to 41% in a period of 4 years, which is unheard of in polling. And the same thing in this country. Whether you're a fan of Stephen Harper or not is a pretty good indication of whether or not you believe in climate change or not. Also where you live. Climate change denial is extremely strong in Alberta. I wonder why. People who are threatened by this science protect themselves from it. Human beings do this. It's just this particular bit of revelation is particularly hard for that worldview. Now, I think we all can figure this out pretty easily why this is happening. What's, I think, more maddening is that many of the people who we thought were the ones who were dealing with climate change, like the big green NGOs, have been really unwilling to talk about things like capitalism and growth and the threat that this actually does pose to our economic model. In fact, they spend a lot of time trying to reassure conservatives that this is really no big deal and can be dealt with within the market model, which is why so many of the so-called solutions to climate change that we have seen over the past decade have been market solutions like carbon trading, carbon offsetting, or consumer solutions like get a hybrid, change your light bulb. So staying within the neoliberal framework. And I'm not going to get into too much of why that happened. I think a lot of it it's much truer in the United States than it is in Canada. I think a lot of it has to do with how these groups are funded. A lot of it just has to do with wanting to be at the political center. And as the center shifted more and more to the right, to have really spoken their truth about what the implications of this science would have meant to become an outsider. That's what it would have meant in the 1980s, to become oppositional. And it was very, very important to the Green movement to maintain access to power. In the book, I quote Gus Speth, who says, the biggest mistake Gus Speth, worked for the Carter administration. He was one of the founders of the National Resources Defense Council. He's sort of the godfather of the US environmental movement in many ways. He said, the mistake we made, the fundamental mistake we made, was not taking on Reagan. We should have been on the outside, and we should have been fighting what he stood for, and instead compromised in order to continue to still have access to power. So this has been a failed strategy on lots of levels, and I'm not going to get into, into exactly how it's failed. I just think we know, right? Emissions are up 54% from when we first started dealing with this crisis, right? These strategies haven't worked. The emissions record speaks for itself. The carbon market in the EU, which has embraced this model, the market model, is a complete catastrophe. It was a magnet for all kinds of fraud. And it also took an issue that was pretty simple, like we have to stop digging this stuff up and burning it, and made it really, really complicated, like as complicated as complex financial mechanisms and derivatives and the rest of it. And it was sort of like, whoa, and people kind of just tuned out. So that's changing. This behavior that we've seen from a lot of the green groups over the past couple decades, it's not how transformative political movements tend to behave. Transformative political movements, and we are talking about a transformation here, understand that they aren't just fighting for one policy here or a policy there. They understand that they're trying to change the values of their culture, the culture in which they exist. They don't just take it at face value and try to figure out, okay, how do we make our issue fit within that world? They say, no, we want to change the world. So, feminists understand and understood that they were fighting patriarchy. They were fighting a system of thought. Abolitionists, the civil rights movement, understood that they were fighting white supremacy. It was a system of thought with a great many invested interests. And in order to win, you have to have a battle of worldviews. You can't just accept that worldview. You have to put another vision forward. And Nelson Mandela, as you know, just passed away. And when Barack Obama spoke at his funeral, he quoted, not his funeral, the memorial service in Soweto, the huge memorial. He quoted one of Mandela's most famous lines, which is, it always seems impossible until it's done. And I think that's a really important sentence to remember when we're faced with these seemingly insurmountable problems. And it's also worth looking at that movement, which won in the 80s. They won when they weren't supposed to win. They won during Reagan's time. They won when everyone else was losing. So how did they win? Well, they built new configurations of counterpower, street power, labor power in the factories and mines in South Africa, divestment power around the world, consumer power through boycotts, cultural power through the arts. And finally, after all of that, the political power began to shift. But the other side of it is that it wasn't only an anti-apartheid movement. It was a movement working towards its own powerful moral vision of the post-apartheid era. This was the rainbow nation that Mandela articulated. They had a dream, right? And that's important. And this is also somewhere where I think those of you who are planning to stay in academia, have a really important role to play. Because it is so important to social movements to have people working on policy and science who are able to tell those movements, your dreams aren't impossible. That these policies are feasible. It's up to the movements to change the political context to make that possible. But having that academic work that says, no, this doesn't break any laws of nature that we're aware of. That's very, very helpful. So the really good news is that things are changing so rapidly in the climate movement. And that what I've been describing, this very conciliatory, reformist idea of how to change the world, has really been left by the wayside. And it's your generation, it's this new generation of climate activists that is rewriting the rules. And just in the past 5 years, we've seen a huge shift in what constitutes climate action. At all of the different sites of extraction, whether it's fracking, that is the impetus, whether it's tar sands, whether it's transporting oil by rail, which we've all seen is so dangerous, it's just the hazard of this model of how to fuel our economies. And people are just saying, we aren't willing to sacrifice our water for this, we aren't willing to sacrifice our land for it, our farmland. I mentioned my family being in British Columbia. There is something so incredibly beautiful about the movement that has emerged on the west coast of this country in response to the plans to build tar sands pipelines, whether it's the Enbridge Northern Gateway or whether it's the Kinder Morgan line expanding that. The way in which British Columbians have rallied together to protect their water, their coast, the way in which people have taken leadership from First Nations, it's unprecedented in this country. And it's given voice to, it's not just about keeping the carbon in the ground, although it is about that. And this is, I talked about how complicated this issue had become. It started to get really simple. My colleague at 350, May Bouvet, who's the executive director of 350, says, when you're in a hole, stop digging. It actually is that simple. We have enough of conventional fossil fuels to carry us through to this transition. The research has been done. We don't need to go after the extra dirty stuff in order to power that transition. If we decide we want to get there, we can get there without fracking, we can get there without tar sands, and we can get that without Arctic drilling. So we need to know that, for starters. And so it's getting simpler. And the other thing that's happening is that in protecting the land, values beyond capitalism are being expressed. Now, what is more important than money? What is more important than jobs? And that is being articulated at things like the Enbridge Gateway hearings, which have been an extraordinary process. We're starting to see some of this in Ontario with Line 9. I think in Ontario, we tend to sort of think, oh, well, nature's something somewhere else. We've already screwed this place up so badly. We don't have much to protect. I put that to Leanne Simpson, who's a wonderful Anishinaabeg writer who has a new book out, which you should really check out, called Islands of Decolonial Love. And I put that question to her in a recent interview, or an interview last year, and she said, well, when your mother is sick, do you stop visiting her, or do you visit her more? It is true. We've done a pretty good job in Southern Ontario of messing things up, but all is not lost. When you're engaged in this kind of anti-extractive activism, whether it's opposing fracking or the pipelines, the response is always, it doesn't matter. They'll get it out somewhere else, right? If they don't build the Keystone XL pipeline, well, they'll build Northern Gateway. If they don't build Northern Gateway, well, it doesn't matter because look at all that fracking that's going on. That's where the real carbon is anyway. So activists are always made to feel like the incredible risks that they're taking are for nothing. They're not for nothing, obviously. They're protecting their land, their water, but they also aren't for nothing when it comes to climate change. But this is where I think young people at universities have a hugely important role to play, and this is where the divestment movement, which is explicitly modeled on the anti-apartheid movement, has been so important because this is a model that's going after the whole fossil fuel sector and saying, your business model is at war with life on Earth. These companies have in their proven reserves, the stuff they're saying to their shareholders, we plan to dig up, 80% more carbon than the atmosphere can absorb and still have a good chance of staying below 2 degrees. We know that. That's what Carbon Tracker in the UK has figured out, has crunched those numbers. So if they are able to continue with their business plan, then we end up with that 4 to 6 degree world that I was describing earlier. So their business model is a problem. These are odious profits that are being earned. And the divestment movement, I don't think should be seen as a separate movement from all of this activism that is happening at the site of extraction and transportation. It's really a pincer that is putting increasing pressure on the fossil fuel companies. And I think we're actually starting to really see the results. Shell just posted record low profits in the last quarter. They said they've put their Arctic drilling plans on ice for now, which is very important. And it was a combination. It's lawsuits. It's First Nations lawsuits. There was a very important lawsuit that Alaskan First Nations were a part of, as well as a bunch of environmental groups. And they won. And it was that precipitated Shell to make that announcement. But they're also just under pressure on all fronts. And they're never going to, you have to understand, they are never going to tell that activists that it's anything that we're doing that is causing this. It's very important to keep people in a state of thinking that what they're doing is irrelevant. But we are starting to see some of these results. And I think, to me, one of the most hopeful things that's going on in this movement is that as these coalitions have emerged, and as First Nations people, particularly in this country, but all over North America, as First Nations people have taken this leadership role, it isn't just a sort of a practical strategy that's come together, where it's like, okay, we both want to protect the water, let's just work together on that. It's that there's been also an intellectual and even a spiritual and cultural cross-pollination that started to happen, where I think non-native Canadians have started to realize that the fact that First Nations people in this country have been protecting their land rights all of these years is probably our best protection against certainly the Harper government's plans to develop this country, which is a plan to just dig as many holes as possible as quickly as possible. And that there's something in the worldview behind those treaties that were signed or not signed, in the case of British Columbia, that has to do with a way to live that is non-extractive. And this is, this is coming back to the title of this gathering, system error. We have an error in our economic operating system. We know that. But our operating system is actually not capitalism. Our operating system is the earth. It's the natural laws that we actually have to obey and find a way to live within. And that's our operating system. And that is, I think, what more and more of us are starting to learn. And I think that the idea that the earth ever was a machine and that we ever were its engineers was the fatal error that we made a few hundred years ago, and that we are starting to unlearn. And it's a process of a combination of new ideas and old ideas coming together. A lot of it is about remembering our own past, remembering how this country was founded and all the pain that entails, and remembering deeper into our own pasts, when our own ancestors didn't believe that the earth was a machine, and had more reverence, and saw themselves as stewards and caretakers, and understood that when they take, they have to give back and have to take care. So I'm not going to steal your title. The title that I have decided to go with is This Changes Everything, as long as my publishers will agree. And I like that title because that's the moment we're in. This crisis we're in changes everything. Everything will change either way. Either the earth changes or we do. Status quo is not one of the options that has been left on the table for us. This changes everything one way or the other. And so it's up to us whether we change or whether we allow change to happen to us. And The really good news is that we still have the power to write another ending to this story, to change the ending. That's a tremendous responsibility that has been given to your generation through no fault of your own. But what you do matters. It matters so much. And that is a heavy, heavy weight. It's also a tremendous privilege and gift. Thank you.